Talking about uh, establishment in Canada, no. So when you say establishment, it's very vague. It's very broad. Okay, so when you talk about establishment, it can be the how long you've been in Canada, circumstances. Again, the circumstances that happen to you in Canada that is beyond your control, the degree of cooperation, I should say, the degree of cooperation that this applicant did to cooperate with the government of Canada with regards to any procedure, any type of application, maintaining your stay, etc. Was a person subjected to a removal order? Titignan din yung degree of or history of employment, the length of your employment. Was there any pattern of stable employment? Was there a pattern of financial management, for example? So things like that. Degree of establishment can also be how long have you been in a community? Are you active in your community? Okay, and a community can be a big or small community, right? If the applicant has moved around, so hence the establishment, right? You actually created a route for yourself in that community, in that city, in that town, etc. Right? Have you integrated yourself with the Canadian life? So a lot of things I actually look into, no, when I do humanitarian, and I do a lot of humanitarians. You can also include the, if you have undertaken any professional certification here in Canada, for example. And it can be, it can be work related. It can be a big factor that will be looked into is whether or not you have a good civil record here in Canada. Do you have any criminal charges? Has there been any abuse, domestic abuse, child abuse, etc.? So those things will be checked, right? And usually it is a stage 1 assessment, okay? So kanina I was actually mentioning about circumstances beyond an applicant's control. So what does that mean? Okay, circumstances beyond your control would be anything that happened to you na biglaan, right? I've had cases where the person has tried to apply for their permanent residence, but then all of a sudden the application program, the permanent residence program, actually just closed on that same day, and the person has proof that they were trying to apply or actually mailed the application already. So things like that, right? Was there any issue with their home country? Meron bang biglaang violence, for example, right? So things that that you can't control. I mean, that that's saying for something, right? If for example the person has been waiting for an application for a long time and then something happened, right? Or the person has been inside Canada for a long time as a worker, for example, but there's basically no application that that he can use or she can use to apply for permanent residence, and you have to show that in your application. What are the circumstances beyond your control? And that you have tried all your best to apply for your permanent residence, right? Katulad ng sinabi ko earlier in the video, humanitarian and compassionate consideration are normally for people who do not fall in any other PR status or PR category, right? You can also include inability to leave Canada, right? And sometimes that can be very broad, very vague, because as I said earlier, assessment is done on a case-to-case basis, and every person has a different case why they do not want to leave Canada, why all of a sudden they cannot leave Canada. Okay, now things that are not considered beyond your control is, for example, applicant goes underground and remains in Canada illegally, right? And that's a very thin line. You have to be careful with that, right? And that's the reason why when doing humanitarian, you have to explain why you lost your status. Have you tried your best to follow the rules and get a status? But, just letting your status go, it should not be considered, sometimes not considered beyond control, right? Because you had control to that, right? So if you just decided to go underground, be illegal, because you're trying to apply for humanitarian, that's basically not the case all the time, okay? You shouldn't really be doing that, okay? Anyone telling you to do that is really misleading you. Okay, so I was actually mentioning, so first a video about some myths surrounding humanitarian and compassionate consideration. And this is basically a common, it's not necessarily for everyone, okay, but this is what I commonly see whenever I do consultations, whenever I do like advices, and with some of the applications I've done before. These are basically the questions I've received over the years regarding humanitarian. First myth na napansin ko for humanitarian is that you would be guaranteed approval if you have a Canadian-born child. Actually, that's not true. That will not be the only basis of a humanitarian and compassionate consideration. Having a Canadian-born child does not make you get an approval, okay? That can be a factor for sure, but that is not the only reason for you to get an approval for humanitarian. Second myth, that it will be harder to get an approval under humanitarian and compassionate consideration if you are single. I don't know why they say this. Maybe because of the degree of establishment. Maybe this is connected to the first myth that I mentioned. But I've been asked several times if would there be an issue kung single sila. They're actually concerned na ma-refuse sila because they're single. Actually, that's not the case. I actually have several applications who were single, are single, and were approved. Third myth, that humanitarian and compassionate consideration can be guaranteed. Can. C-A-N. That's not the case. Humanitarian and compassionate consideration at the first submission alone is 50-50 at best. Why? You are requesting compassionate consideration from an officer, okay? Meaning there's no direct regulation that just because you had this, you had this, you had this, you had this on your application, you will get approved. This is very different from the economic class, where as long as you're not inadmissible, you have a certain English exam results, you have certain work experience, etc., you will get approved. That's not the case with humanitarian. And it will be up to the officer to give you an exemption, okay? Now, I've used the term exemption. That is basically humanitarian compassionate consideration. It is a request to exempt you from the regular process of permanent residence because you don't have any other way to apply for it. Okay? So pag na-approve ang humanitarian mo, what you will receive as a letter is that they are approving your request for exemption and that they will proceed for the permanent residence application. Okay, another myth that I actually see in this type of application is that you must have a status inside Canada to apply. And that if you do not have status, you will be refused. Actually, that's not the case all the time, okay? A lot of my cases actually have no status anymore, and that's the reason why they are requesting exemption, right? And again, I think sinasabi ko din na there's a thin line between how can you provide proof that having no status now was beyond your control. The last one, because we do have lots of myth, but you know, we'll cut it to this. The last myth is that you must have a lot of money in the bank to get approved or to submit a humanitarian and compassionate consideration. And I've seen some applicants fall victim to scammers because of this. You do not need to borrow money just to put it in your bank. Tapos yun ang ipapakita nyo sa application nyo. I mean, it's okay to have money, that's fine. But that, you would have to show where it's coming from. You know, further lies in an application, and this is already a request for exemption, does not do you any good. Okay? It doesn't matter if you have a big money in the bank or no money. Okay? But you would have to provide proof how are you sustaining yourself. In Canada, you do not need to borrow money. Put 10,000, 20,000 in your bank account just because, you know, you're going to submit an application. So, okay, folks, that's another video for you guys. If you like my videos, please do not forget to hit the subscribe button. I would appreciate it very much.